In 1919, the Allied powers of Britain and France would surrender to the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Because of this, both countries would fall into syndicalist revolutions, forcing the current governments to flee to their colonies. This would be terrible for the United States because due to the Allied powers situation, they wouldn't be able to pay back their World War I loans. This, along with the Great Depression and Black Monday, would cause the collapse of the two-party system and the rise of other radical ideologies. Because of this, civil war seemed inevitable, as during this political turmoil, I would play as the federal government under General Douglas MacArthur in a hope to reunite the country. And once the Civil War started, you would think because of my small land area that I would be pretty weak. But thankfully, I would get a non-aggression pact with the Constitutional American Republic, who was in the south, meaning I could focus my whole army on the combined syndicates of America, who was to my north. With my whole army focused on the syndicalist front, I would be able to get an encirclement off in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, leaving Ohio and Michigan free for the taking. After that, the encirclement in Pennsylvania would close, allowing me to focus most of my forces on taking their capital of Chicago. But due to them heavily entrenching the city, I wouldn't be able to take it. But the Constitutional American Republic tried to surprise me and declared war on me. But due to my superior intellect, and more likely because this is my fourth run as a Federalist, I already had troops on the border, and due to being stretched thin, they would capitulate in a short while. With them gone, I would now have a border with the American Union state, who had a bigger and much scarier army. So I decided to dig in and wait for more troops to be deployed and stockpiles to be replenished. But just because I was dug in on the American Union states front doesn't mean I couldn't get up to shenanigans on the combined syndicalist front. Meaning I would try and get some encirclements, and although I got an encirclement off for like 2 seconds, I got too cocky, and 2 of my divisions got encircled instead. But their sacrifice was worth it, as the new borders we had make it easier to encircle them, and with a quick breakthrough I would get the encirclement off, cutting off a large chunk of their army from Chicago, allowing the American Union state to capture and capitulate them. But that was all part of my plan, as with the combined syndicates gone, I could now put my whole army on their border, and although they had the much bigger army, it was split due to also having to fight the Pacific states to their west, leaving their front with me to have many different weak points I could exploit. So I'd get to work, first with an encirclement in the north, second with one in Indianapolis, and then one in the south, until I got my magnum opus, as with the encirclements in Indianapolis in the south, it would set me up to encircle an entire army, plus volunteer forces from other countries. But even with that encirclement, it would take a while before they would capitulate, due to most of their victory points being in Texas, which I only had a small border with, and the Pacific states not being able to push a baby stroller wasn't helping either. But after some time, and somehow pushing the Pacific states almost past the Rockies, the American Union state would capitulate. After this, it was just me and the Pacific states. And to say this is a fair war would be like saying that Israel is not the greatest country on earth. So in just a short while, they would capitulate, leaving just a few loose ends left. First of these loose ends was the Western Command Center, who once the other rival governments were gone and order restored, were talking about silly stuff like MacArthur stepping down and democracy being restored. And of course, MacArthur being the great, just kidding, we invaded them and made MacArthur president for life. Now for the second loose end, which was the territories which broke away from the US when the Civil War happened, chiefly New England. And after asking nicely and definitely not threatening military invasion, they would join back, truly reuniting the United States. And to finish the second loose end, the same super nice letter was sent to Alaska, New York City, and Hawaii. But even though Alaska and New York accepted my demands, Hawaii would reject, which would be something that I would remember for later. And now for the third loose end, which was that our destiny was not manifested enough, which meant Canada and Mexico had to go, starting with Mexico. And even though they are in the Third Internationale with France and Britain, that wouldn't stop me from taking what was rightfully mine. And once my invasion started, there was nothing they could do to stop it. Because of the distance between Mexico and their allies, it would take a long time for their troops to get here, and by the time they did, it was too late. And one of my favorite parts about this mod is once a minor power in an alliance is capitulated, you get the option of white peace with the rest of the faction, so you don't have to be in a forever war with them. This basically allowed me to take Mexico for free. And since I was in the area, I decided to liberate Cuba and Central America, adding them to the glorious United States. But with that dealt with, I can now focus my attention to my neighbor to the north, the Kingdom of Canada. Due to their close ties with us and similar ancestry, they're basically already American, just under British tyranny. So I decided to invade Canada so I could liberate the Canadian people and return them to their homeland. And once I declared war, those maple syrup loving hippies couldn't stop me, as the Canadian army could only muster up 1 to 2 divisions per tile, while I had about 6 to 7. And with this army size disparity, I would quickly take most of Canada, which would be enough for capitulation in basically any other situation, but the mod creators thought it would be super funny to give them a plus 15% surrender limit, meaning I had to basically take every Canadian victory point. And this almost didn't really matter, as I'd quickly take most of their victory points. But when they got to their last victory point, which was Victoria on Vancouver Island, I'd basically have no way of taking it for a while. Because not only was the only way of getting onto the island a single straight crossing, but also because their allies would stack as many divisions as possible onto the straight crossing, meaning I would have to come up with a different plan. But don't worry, MacArthur always has an extra plan up his sleeve, as with the powerful United States Navy, I would be able to gain naval superiority, allowing me to launch a naval invasion on the island. And after some careful planning, I would launch the invasion, which would go perfectly, as there were no divisions anywhere else on the island, which would allow me to encircle and capture the city, capitulating Canada and allowing me to peace out with the rest of the Entente. And now with my destiny manifested, I would actually get around to fixing the country, as I would go down my reconstruction and political tree. And for a while, nothing would happen, as I would build up for my invasions. But my itch for liberating oppressed peoples would get the better of me, as I would go down my expansion tree to get war goals on Northern, South America, and Caribbean nations. And the first nation on my hit list was Costa Rica, and as you would expect, that war didn't last that long. And with them down, they would serve as a perfect launch pad for my naval invasions into the Caribbean and Colombia. So after a bit to plan the invasions, I would declare war, and watch as my masterful plan would succeed in all aspects, as I would quickly take the island of Hispaniola and get a landing in Colombia. And in a short while, I would get Colombia to the breaking point. It would also invade Panama to take back the Panama Canal. But even with these successes, there ain't no rest for the wicked, as I would move to liberate the people of Eastern Africa and Arabia, as when I capitulate Canada, I would also get their colonies on the golden coast of Africa, giving me prime position to invade the rest of Africa. So with this prime positioning, I would invade the KaiserreduX, which consisted of countries from the aforementioned area, but this war would be a slog, as I would invade them through Cameroon, which I could only get military access through, meaning I couldn't build supply hubs, and without supply hubs, that means no supply, which means I basically made no progress. Now you would think with all this warning that I would take a break, but you would be wrong, as I would declare war on Germany to try at least get a piece of their dying empire. But when I invade their African colonies, France would absolutely cuck me, as all the land that I took would just go to France instead of me.
Hold on, cuz. Ready? I think you got more than me.
Which was complete bullshit and may or may not have influenced some of my decisions later on. So if Germany defeated and split up between the victors, I would move to take more of Europe, by first invading Denmark to solidify my foothold on the continent, and also for Greenland and Iceland. Then, I would invade Peru and Ecuador, which has nothing to do with Europe, but who cares. And then, finally, during all of this, I would try to get a breakthrough in Africa against the KaiserreduX, which is also not in Europe, but just shut up, I'm getting there. And because of supply issues, I would pause that war for the time being. So by this point, I would start preparing my grand invasion of Europe, as I would set up a large-scale naval invasion of Britain, as by this point my navy had become unstoppable with the addition of the Canadian and German navies, meaning there wasn't anything they could do to stop me, but they weren't the only target I had, as I would start justifying wars on Austria, France, Poland, and Spain. And the first one on the chopping block was Austria, as they had quickly taken most of Germany, giving me prime position to invade them and possibly cut off some of their troops. But just as I had started my invasion, for some reason the German puppet that Austria had just capitulated came back from the dead to cuck my invasion, meaning I had to wait for the Austrians to reinvade the territory just so I could actually invade them. But after that whole debacle and having a border with Austria again, I would quickly take most of northern Germany from them, and once that was done, my naval invasions would be ready, as I would declare war on Britain and watch as that would take their entire coastline and eventually their whole island. And with Britain down and for some reason not getting a peace deal, I would use them as a launching point for my invasion of Spain. But because I didn't commit that many troops to the invasion, it failed miserably, so I'd start planning a bigger and better invasion in revenge for the proud Americans that had just been killed. But in the meantime, I would start pushing into Austria some more, and after a bit, I would finally get the peace deal for Britain, and because I did all the heavy lifting, I would take all the land. And so, for about the next half year, I would continue pushing to Austria, and even getting a capitulation on them. But by this point, the Southern Slavs have gotten powerful enough to become a major, so it would take a little while longer before I could capitulate the whole faction. And by this point, my naval invasions for Spain were done, and this time with more troops committed and also landing troops in Portugal, I was able to get multiple footholds. And right after this, my war goal would finally be ready on Poland's German puppet. So I would declare the war, and with my newly formed tank divisions, I would quickly advance into their German puppet. And if things couldn't get any better, the Southern Slavs would finally capitulate, and because once again I did all the work, I would take all the land. And so by this point, I would start preparing for my war of France, as I would put my newly arrived troops all over the fronts I had with them. But just after I started justifying war on them, they would do the honor of declaring war on me first, which would be a fatal mistake. Also, I just wanted to say the leader of France looked exactly like Curtis Leelaw. I mean, same pose, same hat, same everything. But anyway, back to the vid. But the surprise war wouldn't amount to anything, as all it did would let me take them down quicker than I would have otherwise, as their German puppet fell quickly as the war seemed to be a surprise even to them, as there are basically no troops on the border. But even when the troops came, they were no match for mine, as I would quickly move through the French countryside. And while I was quickly pushing through France, I would get a peace deal for Poland, and after some more pushing into France, I would get one for them too, meaning that Spain lasted longer than Austria, France, and Poland, so props to them. But perhaps we're going to save them now, as with France down, their fate was ensured. Also of France's capitulation, I would get North Africa under my control, meaning I would actually have a good front to push the Cairo Axis through, meaning that the war I started about 3 years ago would finally end. But still, even though the land I was pushing through was better than before, that didn't mean it was the best, as I would start justifying on the Ottomans for not only a new front, but also for that sweet chromium to build even more tanks with. And of course, once I declared the war, it went about how you would expect it to go, as I'd quickly overrun them, as I would also launch naval invasions in their south, and once I had them capitulate, I would not only get a new front with the Cairo Axis, but also a new front with the Entente, which meant I could finish out the last major Entente nation, which was India. But by this point, I just didn't really care, as I had been recording for about 6 hours by this point and the game was starting to run like absolute garbage, so I would just start nuking basically anything of value they had and hope to end the war any faster, which worked for Egypt because after nuking them a couple times, they would capitulate. And now with India being the only country left between me and peace, I would unleash absolute terror across India. I would start thermonuclear and atomic bombing every city in India, and also having Japan invading from their east, it was just only a matter of time before they capitulated, and eventually they would. But by this point I was tired. I could have invaded Russia, Japan, or China, and if I really felt like it, all of them all at the same time, but by this point they would have just been a cakewalk for me. So, with it being 1946 and already done enough liberating for one playthrough, I decided to end the run here.